I grew up in a house where everything looked fine from the outside. Two-car garage, good school district, the kind of street where neighbors wave without meaning it. My mother liked to say we were a close family. What she meant was we were good at pretending. My brother was the one people remembered. Loud, charming, the type who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they'd been waiting for him. My parents called it personality. My father, before everything changed, used to say my brother had the kind of charisma that opened doors. What no one mentioned was that once he got through the door, he never cleaned up after himself. I was the quiet one. The one who stayed late, double-checked things, made sure the numbers added up. I got a degree in accounting, passed my CPA exam on the first try, and took a position at a mid-size forensic accounting firm downtown. Nobody threw a party for that. My mother told her neighbor I worked in finance, the same flat tone she used to describe uninteresting weather. When my father was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, I was the one who flew home first. Not because anyone called me first, they called my brother first, the way they always did, but because I was the one who actually came. My brother sent a text that said, "Keep me posted." My mother cried on the phone and said she didn't know how to handle the paperwork. I told her I'd be there by Thursday. I took a leave of absence, packed a bag that turned into a suitcase, and moved back into my childhood bedroom. It smelled like old carpet and decisions I'd already outgrown. But my father needed someone who understood care schedules and insurance claims, and the difference between a durable power of attorney and a limited one. So I stayed. My brother showed up 6 weeks later. He'd lost another job, something in sales that hadn't worked out, which was how most of his things worked out, and he came home the way he always did, with stories that made him sound like the victim and enough charm to make my mother forget she'd been managing alone. Within a week, he was sleeping in his old room, eating my mother's cooking, and referring to himself as the one handling Dad's affairs. That was the phrase that should have been my first warning. Handling Dad's affairs. My father had named both of us as co-agents under his power of attorney. I had arranged that, specifically so no single person had unchecked control. But my brother had gone to the bank with my father on one of Dad's clearer days, or what my brother told him was a routine errand, and somehow walked out with updated signature authority on 2 accounts. Sole authority. I didn't find out until 3 months later, when I was going through the quarterly statements my father's financial advisor sent to the house. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with those papers. The morning was ordinary coffee going, my father watching a nature program in the living room, my mother somewhere upstairs. I had a yellow notepad, a pen, and the quiet focus that my job had trained into me. I wasn't looking for anything wrong. I was just organizing. Then I saw the withdrawals. 11 transfers over 4 months. Small enough individually to avoid automatic flags, large enough, added together, to total $43,000. The destination account wasn't one I recognized. I wrote down the routing number with the same calm I used at work, because that's what you do when the evidence is still assembling itself. You don't react. You document. I spent the next 2 days going through every statement, every file, every document in the accordion folder my father kept in his desk. That was when I found the transfer authorization form, the one with both our signatures on it, giving permission to move a portion of the accounts into what was described as a family trust for asset protection. My signature was at the bottom. Neat, precise, matching mine closely enough to pass a casual inspection. I had never signed that form. I took a photo of it on my phone. Then I took photos of the bank statements. Then I sat very still at that kitchen table for a long time, listening to the nature program in the other room and the sound of my father laughing softly at something on the screen. That evening, my brother came home around 7. He dropped his keys on the counter the way he always did, helped himself to whatever was in the refrigerator, and stood in the kitchen doorway asking my mother about dinner like a man who'd been busy all day doing important things. I was at the table with my laptop. I didn't say anything yet. My mother set a plate in front of him. She asked how his day was. He said, "Good, busy." He'd been looking into some investment options for Dad's portfolio. She nodded like this was normal and reasonable, because to her it was. He had always been the one with big ideas. I had always been the one who quietly made sure the lights stayed on. I waited until she went to check on my father. Then I set the bank statement on the table in front of my brother. He looked at it. His expression didn't change the way guilty people think it won't change. It changed the way people change when they realize they've been caught but haven't decided what to do about it yet. A small tightening around the eyes. A breath held half a second too long. "That's just a transfer for the trust account," he said. "We talked about this, remember? At Thanksgiving." "I wasn't at Thanksgiving," I said. "I was in Portland for a work conference." "You knew that." He shrugged. "Maybe it was before." Dad agreed to it. "I have documentation." "You have my signature on documentation," I said. "I didn't sign it." He put his fork down. The kitchen was quiet except for the television in the other room and the low hum of the refrigerator. I watched his face move through calculations. "You're making this into something it isn't," he said. "I work in forensic accounting," I said. "This is exactly what it is." That was when things changed. He stood up fast, faster than I expected, the chair scraping hard against the tile. He came around the table and grabbed my arm, not gently pulling me up from my seat like he was going to physically relocate me from the conversation. I pulled back. He shoved me, both hands against my shoulders, and I hit the edge of the counter hard enough that I felt it in my ribs for a week. "Stop acting like you run this family," he said. His voice was low and flat, nothing like the charming version he used for everyone else. My mother appeared in the doorway. She had heard the chair. She saw me against the counter, saw him standing over me, and for 1 second I thought I actually believed that she would say something real. "Both of you, stop it," she said. "You're going to upset your father." That was it. That was the whole response. I straightened up. I didn't cry. I pressed my hand to my ribs and breathed slowly and looked at my mother standing in the doorway with that carefully neutral expression she'd spent 30 years perfecting. "He forged my signature," I said. "You don't know that," she said. "I work in forensic accounting, Mom. You work with numbers. That doesn't mean you know everything." She turned to my brother. "Go check on your father." He left the room without looking at me. She followed him. I stood alone in the kitchen with a bruised side and $43,000 in missing money and a forged document with my name on it. I did not call the police that night. Not because I was afraid, but because I needed the evidence assembled correctly before I made a move. That's the thing about working in fraud. You learn that a case built in anger is a case built on sand. You wait. You document. You let the record speak. What my brother didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I had installed a security camera in the kitchen 4 months earlier. Not because I suspected anything then. I'd installed it to monitor the home caregiver we'd hired for Tuesday and Thursday mornings to make sure my father was being treated properly. It was a small device, ceiling-mounted near the smoke detector, connected to cloud storage. It had been recording all evening. The next morning, I drove to my office downtown. I hadn't called ahead, but my supervisor had told me when I left that the door was open if I needed anything. I sat across from him with a printed copy of the bank statements, the transfer authorization form, and a time-stamped screenshot of the camera footage on my phone, showing my brother shoving me into the counter while my mother stood in the doorway. My supervisor didn't say much at first. He looked at the documents the way I would have looked at them carefully, without reaction, cataloging. Then he looked at me. "Is your father able to give a statement?" he asked. "On good days," I said, "but his memory of signing anything is unreliable at this stage." "That actually helps you," he said. "It establishes that he was vulnerable." He turned the authorization form over in his hands. "This signature has been practiced. Someone spent time on this." He set it down. "You need to file a report with Adult Protective Services and contact the DA's office. I can connect you with someone in their financial crimes unit." "What about the assault?" He looked at the screenshot again. "That goes to the police. Today." I filed the police report that afternoon. The officer who took my statement was thorough and unhurried. She asked me to walk through the evening twice, in order. I did. She asked about the camera. I gave her the cloud storage login and the timestamp. She watched the footage on her department tablet with the same stillness I recognized from people who process difficult things professionally. "We'll need the full recording," she said. "I'll authorize access tonight," I said. When I got back to my car, I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. Not because I was falling apart, because I had spent 30 years being the background to someone else's story, and I needed a moment to understand that this time the record was going to tell a different one. Adult Protective Services opened a case within 48 hours. The Financial Crimes Unit from the DA's office contacted me the following week. A detective named Walsh sat across from me in a conference room at my firm, where my supervisor had arranged for me to walk them through the forensic trail. I had prepared a spreadsheet, dates, amounts, account numbers, the gap between my father's actual cognitive assessments and the date the bank documents were signed. Walsh tapped his pen on the table. 11 transfers, he said. 11, I confirmed. The last 3 happened after his diagnosis was in his medical file, which the bank had on record because we submitted it when we updated his account preferences. So the bank knew he had a cognitive impairment. And someone still got sole signature authority, I said. Walsh didn't editorialize. He wrote something in his notebook and said they would be subpoenaing the bank records directly. At home, or what had been home, my mother called me twice. The first call I let go to voicemail. She said I was overreacting, that I was tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding, that my father wouldn't want this. The second call I answered, because I wanted her to hear my voice when I said what I said. A detective from the DA's office has the camera footage. Mom. Adult Protective Services has opened an elder abuse case. And the bank has been subpoenaed. I paused. If you gave a statement saying you didn't see anything, I would think carefully about that statement. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your brother loves your father. He stole from him." I said, "Those aren't the same thing." I went back to the house once, with a police escort, to collect my personal belongings and some of my father's financial files. My father was sitting in his chair by the window. When I walked in, he looked up at me. He didn't always know my name anymore. Some days he thought I was a neighbor, or a nurse, or someone he'd worked with decades ago. That day, he looked at me and said, "There you are." I sat with him for 20 minutes before I packed anything. He told me about a fishing trip he and his father had taken when he was 12. He told it with complete clarity, every detail sharp and present. I held his hand and listened and didn't think about the paperwork waiting in the other room. When I stood up to go, he patted my hand and said, "You were always the careful one. I always knew you'd take care of things." I didn't answer. I just squeezed his hand and went upstairs to get my boxes. The case moved faster than I expected because the evidence was not complicated. The camera footage was clear and unambiguous. The forged signature was confirmed by a handwriting expert the DA's office brought in. She testified later that it had been traced rather than signed naturally, based on the pen pressure patterns. The bank records showed that my father had been brought in on a day when his primary care physician had noted, in records subpoenaed alongside the financials, that he was experiencing significant disorientation and should not be making financial decisions without advocacy support. My brother hired a private attorney. I'd been told they would try to frame it as a family matter that had gotten out of hand. They did exactly that. At the preliminary hearing, his attorney stood and spoke about family stress and caregiving pressure and the complexity of managing an aging parent's affairs. He mentioned my brother's good character, his community ties, his devotion to our father. He called the assault a minor physical altercation between siblings that had been taken out of context. I sat at the table beside the DA's representative and did not change my expression. I had spent years in rooms where people tried to make fraud sound like something else. I recognized the language. It was always the same. Minimize, contextualize, redirect. The DA's representative placed a copy of the financial summary on the judge's bench. She was methodical and quiet, which is the only way to present evidence correctly. She walked through each transfer. She presented the handwriting analysis. She submitted the camera footage into the record. The judge watched the footage once. Then he asked the defense attorney a question. "In the footage, does your client's sister appear to be the aggressor?" The attorney hesitated. "Your Honor, the context of the argument. I asked about the footage," the judge said. "No," the attorney said. "And at the time of this incident, your client had sole access to an account from which $43,000 had been transferred over 4 months? The transfers were for legitimate transfers made using a document that a certified handwriting expert has determined was forged." The judge set down the footage summary. "I've seen enough." The formal charges filed were elder financial abuse, a felony under state law, and misdemeanor assault. There was also a charge of document fraud related to the forged signature. my mother testified. I wasn't in the room for her testimony, but the DA's representative told me afterward that she had initially repeated the story she'd settled on, that she hadn't seen anything clearly, that it all happened very fast, that she wasn't wearing her glasses. The prosecutor had then shown her a still frame from the camera footage, taken at the precise moment she was standing in the doorway, looking directly at the scene. After that, her testimony became considerably shorter and more careful. The judge addressed that in his final remarks. He noted that witnesses who adjust their recollection when presented with video evidence were not witnesses. He noted it clearly, on record, with the particular quiet that judges use when they want something to be understood without having to be repeated. My brother received 32 months and full restitution of the $43,000, plus interest. The restitution would be returned to my father's accounts, now under a court-appointed financial guardian, a professional, not a family member, until a more permanent arrangement could be reviewed. The judge also issued a protective order, barring my brother from contact with my father. There was a moment, right after the sentence was read, when I looked across the room. My brother was staring at the table. My mother was sitting very still with her hands folded in her lap, the way she sat when she didn't know which performance fit the occasion. For a moment she looked at me, and her expression was something I didn't have a word for. Not guilt exactly, not apology, more like the face of someone who has just realized the map they were using was always wrong. I didn't hold her gaze long. I turned back toward the exit. Outside the courthouse, the DA's representative shook my hand. She said the forensic documentation had made it one of the cleaner elder abuse cases she'd worked. She said it in the tone of a professional, giving a professional a straightforward assessment, and I appreciated that. I didn't need comfort. I needed accuracy. I called my firm from the parking lot to let them know I'd be back in the office the following Monday. My supervisor said, "Take more time if you need it." I said I didn't. I meant it. The hardest part wasn't the trial. The hardest part was the weeks after, when everything settled into its new shape and I had to decide what I was going to do with it. My father was moved to a memory care facility with proper staffing and oversight. I visited twice a week. Some visits he knew me. Some visits he thought I was an old friend of his mother's. Either way, I brought him coffee from the place on the corner that he'd always liked, and I sat with him, and we watched whatever was on the television, and that was enough. My mother called once, about 3 weeks after sentencing. She didn't apologize exactly. She said she'd been thinking. She said she didn't understand how things had gotten so far. She said she hoped I knew she loved me. I told her I knew. I also told her that love without honesty was just habit dressed up in feeling. That I wasn't angry. That I just needed her to understand that some things, once they're on record, don't get filed away quietly. She said she understood. I don't know if she did. I went back to work. The cases on my desk were waiting with the patient indifference of unopened files. I sat down at my desk on a Monday morning, coffee at my elbow, notepad ready, and pulled up the first one. It was a small business dispute, possible skimming by a bookkeeper, about 6 months of records to go through, ordinary, methodical, exactly the kind of work that most people consider invisible until something goes wrong. My desk sits near a window that overlooks the street below. Sometimes, between documents, I look out at the people walking by, the ones who don't know each other, who aren't pretending to, who are just going about their lives without the particular weight of a family that asks them to stay small. I don't envy them exactly. I just notice the freedom in ordinary movement. A colleague stopped by my desk that first week back. She asked how I was doing, the genuine version of the question, not the office hallway version. I told her fine. She nodded like she knew there was more to that and respected that I wasn't going to say it yet. That evening, I drove to see my father. He was in the common room with a few other residents, watching the early news. When I sat down beside him, he turned to look at me with that searching expression he had now, the one where you could see him trying to find the file. Then something settled in his face. Not full recognition, but something close to comfort. "I know you," he said. "Yes," I said. "You do." We sat there while the news played and the light went orange through the window and the room smelled like dinner being prepared down the hall. I didn't think about the trial. I didn't think about my brother or my mother or the $43,000 that would slowly be returned to an account my father would never personally manage again. I thought about the camera I had installed to protect him, the one that had, in the end, protected me too. There's a particular kind of justice that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need a dramatic moment or a speech or a scene where the right person finally says the right thing. It just moves through the system, precise and unhurried, until the record reflects what actually happened. That's what I had been trained to understand, first theoretically and then, it turned out, personally. On my desk at work, next to my monitor, I keep one thing that isn't work-related. It's a sticky note with 6 words that I wrote on my first day back. Document everything. Let the record speak. My father told me once, during one of his clear evenings, that the most important thing about honest work was that you didn't have to remember what you said, because you always said the same thing, the truth. Plainly, without decoration. I understand that better now than I ever did. The restitution payments started arriving in my father's account in scheduled quarterly installments, per the court order. I reviewed each one when it came in habit more than necessity. The amounts were correct. The dates were accurate. Everything in its right place, exactly as the record required. I closed the statement each time, saved the confirmation, and went back to work. That's what the end of something looks like when you've done it right. Not noise. Not triumph. Just the quiet click of a file closing, and the next one already open on your desk.